Well, welcome everybody to our third session for Cultivating Healthy Minds. This session, we're going to begin right here shortly, just making sure we got everyone kind of coming on. Looks like we have a few participants joining us. This is going to be the third session for Cultivating Healthy Minds. Topic is going to be tackling trauma. This is going to be a session where we'll have our testimonial, which is going to be Jaclyn Darling, and then also Dr. Shannon Ferrell, who's going to be our keynote speaker for this webinar. We're excited to be able to have you guys tune in for this, for the Cultivating Healthy Mind session. This is going to be our final webinar session. You can join us for our final in-person series, which is going to be at the state convention. That's going to be Friday, November 8th at the Oklahoma Farm Bureau State Convention. You can register that on the website. Whenever you go on there, there's going to be an option for the luncheon as well. So if you want to join us for that luncheon, just be sure that that is checked. I want to make sure we have a good and accurate head count there. All these sessions are recorded and they're going to be on our YouTube page. So if you have someone that wasn't able to join today, we would love for them to be able to see this material and share that. I know I've shared it to quite a few people already myself. So that's what it's there for. Anyone who needs to see this or may need help or want to use this as a resource, this is always a great tool at your disposal. Okay, well, without further ado, I want to introduce our testimonial speaker, Jaclyn Darling. Jaclyn and her husband, LC, currently serve on our wife and our state committee. They're from District 8. They're located around the Colgate area. They've been heavily involved in Oklahoma Farm Bureau over the past few years, and they've done a wonderful job in their leadership role here at Oklahoma Farm Bureau. They run a cow-calf operation with their family. They also help manage their rural water district. That keeps them tied up quite a bit. Jaclyn also just took a job working for National Livestock, and she does marketing and financials there. On top of all of that, she's also a terrific mother, and she has a 2-year-old daughter, Zula. Just a beautiful little girl. They're a wonderful family, and we're excited to have Jaclyn joining us today to talk about her testimonial. So without further ado, Jaclyn, take it away.
Hey guys, as Jacob said, my name is Jaclyn Darling. My husband and I are raising our daughter here on our ranch in Cole County, Oklahoma, where I grew up. I am a third-generation rancher on a cow-calf operation, getting to raise the fourth generation along with the first generation, so it's a great combination to get to be a part of. Today's Healthy Minds seminar is over traumatic experiences, specifically in the agricultural industry. So whenever I was 13 years old, 2 months before I turned 14, back in 2009, I was raking hay that summer in July, like every ranch kid in Oklahoma does. We're running tractors, we're doing things. My grandpa had me and my cousin, who is the same age as me, Sam. We were raking and belling, and my grandpa and my other cousin were in a different part of the hayfield. They couldn't really see us. We're in southern Oklahoma, so as you can imagine, there's hills and trees. So we had the old style drag rakes where you make a round and then you hurry as fast as you possibly can to make another round before the baler gets there. So I'm going through doing that, and the back of my rake catches an old rotten power line, and the power line ends up falling over onto my tractor. So 13-year-old Jaclyn doesn't really know what to do, but she sees that the field's on fire. So my first instinct was to get off the tractor and try to get this fire put out before we lose our hay crop. It was one of our biggest meadows. And whenever I do that, I have a hold, it's an open cab tractor, so I have a hold of the handrail, and whenever I step off, I automatically ground. So that is the accident that caused me to lose part of my foot and my left foot. That's when the electricity entered, and then it exited through my right leg, just kind of went up and out. So with that, it caused me to be burned on 33% of my body. And then that means that you also get to have 33% of your body for skin grafts to cover the burns. So, rural Oklahoma, my cousin Sam, he was so smart. He knew like, hey, this is what's happened. I can't get off too. But he was smart enough to call EMS, got EMS out there. On the call, he told them, like, you have to get a helicopter out here. It's bad. So that one call is what saved my life. They air evac'd a helicopter to the hayfield. The helicopter was there 5 minutes after EMS showed up. So that was so critical. They took me to St. Francis in Tulsa. I was only there for about 3 hours, and some family friends had contacts with a Shriner in the Muskogee area, and he got me in at the Shriners Burn Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio. They had just had a hurricane in the Houston area, so I couldn't go to the Shriners Hospital there. So got to go even further from home. And I spent the next 8 weeks at the Cincinnati Shriners Burn Hospital, recuperating, had 10 surgeries. Two of the surgeries lasted over 8 hours. It was a really hard time for my family. We're a ranch family. We were in the middle of hay season. We're weaning calves. We have all the things going on. So my mom and dad had to make the really difficult decision that only one parent was going to be able to be with me for that 8 week duration. So my mom and I stayed in Ohio for 8 weeks by myself. My dad and some other family members were able to come and visit me about 4 or 5 times, but that was really hard for me. And it was really hard for my mom. And then it was even harder coming back home because I had missed 2 months at being home, going into the 8th grade. That's a fun time, middle school. And then, you come back, you have all these scars as a young child. And it's difficult because you're this new person. You look a lot different. That first year was really hard because they make you wear pressure garments and things. And while all your other friends are getting to go on spring break and fall break, you're getting to go back to Ohio to the hospital to do follow-up surgeries. So for my whole basically high school career until I was a senior, I would go back to Ohio at least 3 times a year for them to do just follow-up surgeries, checkups, making sure everything was good. But now I get to, anytime there's like a burn accident in our area, I always get to follow up with that person, check in on them, tell them everything's going to be okay. As long as you have a beautiful attitude, nobody cares about the scars. And it's just really been a humbling experience, but it was very hard. And my family has done so well with it. For all the life moments you struggle because you see and the guilt, I think as farm parents, now that I'm a parent now, I understand it more. The guilt that you take on, should I have let my 13-year-old rake hay? Should I have done this? Should I have done that? But I think in the ag industry, we know that yes, that's exactly what you should have let your child do. God's in control and they'll be okay. If something happens, they're going to be okay. And it was for a reason. So that is a little bit of my story. If anyone has any questions afterwards, just get into contact with me. I'm sure Jacob can give you my phone number. If you know anyone kind of going through the same situation, just reach out to me and I can definitely help. Thank you guys.
Jaclyn, thank you so much for sharing that. That takes a lot of courage to be able to do that, be able to come on here and talk about your story, your experience, and share that with us to get us to understand what you've been through. I love how you've turned this into a opportunity to be able to help others that have done or have had situations similar to what you've been through. That's such a just very telling part of who you are. You clearly care a lot about helping others and making sure that they have resources too. And we really appreciate you coming on, Jaclyn. Thank you so much for sharing that. Um, we're going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Shannon Ferrell here. He's a professor of agricultural economics at Oklahoma State University, where he specializes in agricultural law as an educator and speaker. Um, he's helped audiences from all around North America understand the fundamental legal elements of farm businesses, management, and family transition planning. And he has testified before Congress and the Oklahoma legislature on multiple policy issues involved in farm transitions, from regulatory barriers in the transition process to retirement and savings for other farmers and ranchers. Dr. Ferrell's work in transition planning has shown him the importance of mental well-being for farm families. Uh, Thank you, Dr. Ferrell, for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
All right. Hey, thank you all for having me. Happy Friday, Orange Friday, everyone. Go Pokes. As you can tell from the orange outfit, although I'm proud to report to you that I am coming from new agricultural hall on the campus of Oklahoma State University, which is why there is nothing behind me. The walls are bare, but don't feel bad. It's not just inside my office. They're bare outside too. So we're desperately trying to get some ag pictures up there. So if anyone wants to make any donations, let us know. First off, you're thinking to yourself, why in the world is a lawyer talking to me about anything related to mental health? I thought lawyers were the ultimate enemy of mental health, and you might be right there. But just a little bit of background. The way that I came to my work in rural mental health was actually through exactly what Jacob said, my work with farm transitions. I started out working in farm transitions nearly 20 years ago now, and I thought it was all about knowing which entity form to have. Do I need to have a trust? Do I need to have a will? What tax strategies do I need to use? And all of that stuff's important, but the more that I dug into it, the more I realized that the real meat and potatoes of family transitions in business was the family part. And the understanding family relationships means you have to understand emotions, which led me to understand emotional well-being, which got me into mental health. And we were really trying to make some strides in some mental health programming in the late 20-teens when ag commodity prices were kind of rough. And then what do you know, this pandemic comes along, and we had a physical health crisis, the likes of which we'd never really seen as a country, but we also had a mental health crisis, the likes of which we'd never seen as a country. So I am not a therapist. I'm just an enthusiastic amateur, and I act as a bridge between the folks who are licensed therapists and our extension audiences. So the materials that I'm going to present for you today were largely developed by Dr. Cami Gallus. She's a professor in our Department of Human Development and Family Science here at OSU. She did all the heavy lifting. I'm the guy that gets to deliver it, and I'm pretty excited about that. I also want to extend a really heartfelt thanks to Jaclyn for sharing what she did. As we go through today's discussion, you're going to find that Jaclyn went through what we call capital T trauma. That's a traumatic event. And I am so thankful, Jaclyn, that you had the courage and the ability to share that with everyone. And that everybody knows, like, big bad stuff happens and it affects you. And the question is, all right, what do we do with those effects? Can we move forward with that? So with that, we'll kind of get into today's content, which is all about tackling trauma. So I'm going to start to share my screen here. Hopefully you guys get to see a lovely PowerPoint show. All right. If anybody can't see the PowerPoint, let me know in Q&A or shoot me a message, but we'll do our best here. Like I said, very happy to have developed these materials with Dr. Cami Gallus. She did this as part of our mental health grant program that we had through the Southern Risk Management Center a few years ago. And we've just continued to try to grow and develop those materials because we still have stuff to do when it comes to mental health and agriculture, believe it or not. So before I really share anything with you guys today, I need to share you this very important concept. We're going to talk a lot today about how disaster and trauma affect us and how we respond to that. And a big chunk of that is quite simply how our brain is wired. So I need you to understand your brain is wired to keep you alive. Everything that's kind of hardwired into our nervous system is there to help us run away from bears and tigers, or to fight bears and tigers. And if we can't run away or fight, for us to play possum until the bear or tiger goes away, right? But trauma affects us in ways that we really wouldn't foresee. But if we understood how our brain and our nervous system responds to stressors, we'd go, okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense. So everything we talk about today, just remember, we're trying to deal with what we're hardwired to do, but what we can learn to do to help us deal with that as well. So I've talked about this before to other audiences, but I think it's important to mention today as well. We have this concept here at OSU that we call toxic grit. And that's just based on the fact that, you know what, we're farmers, and we have all of these traits that are supposed to be about toughness and resilience, and that's all nifty. But sometimes those same things that help us to be tough might get in the way of us being resilient. And there's a difference between tough and resilient. In agriculture especially, we view toughness as being unaffected by things. Hey, Jaclyn got literally electrocuted, and look, she was back on the tractor as soon as she got home. Or, this person went through a wildfire that basically burned down their entire ranch. This person went through a tornado. This person went through accident XYZ, and look, they're completely unaffected. Well, that might be toughness, but I would argue it's kind of hard to be a normal human being and not be affected by that stuff. So maybe what we're talking about isn't so much toughness as it is resilience, our ability to take a hit, and maybe it knocks us back a little bit, but we let that happen, we adapt, and we can come back in a healthy way. So that's kind of how I draw the distinction between toughness and resilience. And maybe what we need to be focusing on is resilience. So in agriculture, obviously, we're pretty fiercely self-reliant people, right? We have to take care of ourselves, but that makes us isolated sometimes. And isolation is where mental health issues go to thrive. We'll talk about that several times throughout the day. And in agriculture, we're just kind of already naturally isolated. We have to work extra hard, even harder than other folks around us, to make sure that we maintain the connections that keep us well-adjusted and healthy. We've already kind of talked about toughness, but remember, everybody's affected by stuff. Even that most tough person in your life you think isn't affected by stuff, I got a deep, dark secret for you. They're affected by stuff. They might be really good at not showing it, but I guarantee you there's something going on there behind the scenes. So let's just kind of lean into that for right now. We're all told by our dads or our grandpas or whatever to suck it up, buttercup, right? Whenever something bad happens, you don't act like it affects you, just keep on moving on. And hey, we need resilience, right? We need to be able to take tough things happening to us in agriculture if we're going to have any shot in this industry, which, by the way, is ranked as one of the top 10 most stressful industries in America by professional psychologists. And oh, by the way, that includes military, police, firefighters. We're up there with them, okay? So sure, we have to be tough. We have to be resilient. But what we often do in agriculture is use this as a very convenient excuse to not talk about our feelings, to not express them, to just bottle them up and bottle them up and bottle them up. Guys, I'm here to tell you, that's not healthy, okay? You've got to find some way to deal with those feelings in some way. And that's part of you being tough, okay? Especially in agriculture, and again, I deal with this a lot in my transition work. One of our strengths is that we have a multi-generational legacy for lots of our farms and ranches. I mean, you heard Jaclyn say it herself, like she's a third generation operating her ranch. I go to some programs throughout the state, we have third, fourth, fifth generation operators out there. And you can draw a lot of strength from that heritage and take pride in the fact that you've been able to maintain this business for so long. But man, the counterpoint to that is, does that make us a lot more nervous about something happening to the farm on our watch? What if I'm the one that loses the farm? What if I'm the one that doesn't, quote, keep it together? Never mind the fact that you're facing challenges in 21st century agriculture that would not have even been imagined by the person who homesteaded your farm or ranch, okay? So let's make sure that's a strength and not a liability for us. And last, and certainly not least, hey, in agriculture, we are fantastic about surrounding each other with love and support in a time of crisis. We're phenomenal at that. But when it comes to a mental health concern, now all of a sudden people kind of go like, oh, well, feelings. I'm not really comfortable with feelings, and Ferrell's having a lot of those feelings right now. I'm going to leave him alone and let him deal with that. What did I just say earlier in this same slide? Isolation is where mental health issues go to thrive. So we've unconsciously withdrawn from a person who may be going through a mental health crisis, further isolating them. That's exactly the last thing we need to do, okay? So when we surround someone in community and support, we need to be there when the traumatic event has occurred, but we also need to recognize we need to be there for the long haul and be alongside that person throughout their entire experience as they process that. So having laid kind of our foundation here, let's start talking about what trauma is. And for the first part of our program today, I'm going to talk about disaster response and trauma kind of side by side, because lots of times we encounter trauma as a result of a disaster, but they're not the same thing. And we'll draw that distinction. But for so many of us in agriculture, like I said, we're in a risky industry. Things happen. So let's kind of talk about that for a second. If we're talking about, a disaster, right? We might be talking about something that affects a lot of people. I think the very recent example is what happened with Hurricane Helene and what happened in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. I actually just talked to my friend who's an attorney with North Carolina Farm Bureau, checking on him and his family, and they really said, hey, if you want to help out there, we really encourage donations to the American Red Cross, but also to Baptists on Mission. They're kind of the Baptist Disaster Relief Organization for North Carolina, much like our Oklahoma Baptist Disaster Relief is here for our state. But they said that they've really partnered with them and have been partnering with them for a while to lend support there. So if your heart's reaching out to the farmers in Tennessee and North Carolina, there's a way that you can respond. But I use that as an example because hundreds and thousands of people were affected by that event. They lost homes, they lost farms, they lost ranches, they lost infrastructure, they lost schools and, the public support structures that make their communities, stay together. So that's a disaster that affected a lot of people. Now, some people will go through that and they have the resilience, they have the support around them that they need, and they'll be okay. They'll process that event, they'll go through that and go, wow, that was kind of tough. I'm so grateful that I was able to make it through, or that I had the help that I needed. But for some people, that's going to be an individually traumatic expense. They may have been subject to a water rescue. They may have been in a flooded house waiting for help. They may have, had the loss of their entire livelihood, and now they have no idea where to go. So like we said, a disaster might affect a lot of people. How it affects each of us individually may be the source of the trauma. And to kind of reiterate something we talked about on our toxic grit slide there just a few moments ago, when there is a disaster, boy, it sure seems like there is often a lot of help. We are so blessed here in the United States that when something bad happens, there are relief organizations and people that care passionately, and they come at us with truckloads of water, truckloads of food, truckloads of clothes to replace what was lost. And they're there to help. And, in Oklahoma, I think we're the gold standard on this. That's why we have the Oklahoma standard, right? So we're there to help that community, and we're there to help the individuals in the community. But oftentimes, trauma, the experience that we have coming out of the disaster, might make us isolated. So while there's this huge sense of community providing support there, we might not be able to experience that because we're basically kind of isolating ourselves from that, or the experience may just have been isolating to us, right? So when we're talking about disaster, that's really what you probably think of when we think about the Barnesdall tornado, when we think about the Hurricane Helene impacts in the Southeast, right? It's something that happens unexpectedly. It's something that's very sudden. It's very disturbing in terms of just the disruption of daily life to the people around. And it probably affects a large swath of people, okay? But if we want to drill down, let's talk about what trauma is. Trauma may very often be a response to a disaster, but it doesn't have to be a disaster that affects a lot of people. If we're in a car accident, that may have only affected us if it's a single car accident, right? But that's very traumatic to us. So when we're talking about that classification of what we call shock trauma, we're saying like, wow, there was some big physical event that affected our well-being in some way. It was physically or very psychologically threatening directly to us, right? Shock trauma is what we would most often associate with a disaster if we're talking about flood, tornado, fire, that kind of stuff. But there can also be other experiences that aren't necessarily affecting a lot of people, or maybe not have one acute event, right? They may be there over some time. Dealing with chronic adversity, right? If you grew up in an impoverished, neighborhood, or your family faced poverty, there may not have been one specific traumatic thing that happened to you, but over time, wow, it kind of started to pile up. People have had to suffer through abuse or neglect, or just are in an environment where they don't feel safe. Over time, that builds up to be trauma. And then, of course, we kind of talked about chronic or toxic stress. In other words, we're just constantly in an environment where no one big thing ever happens, but we're just constantly in an agitated state, or if we're just in a negative environment. Those are all things that can accumulate trauma, which we would probably define as an experience, or our injury rather, from the experience that overwhelms our ability to adapt to it. If we can continue to adapt to what's happening, if we can keep maintaining resilience, then a really bad thing may never cause trauma. And that happens all the time, right? People go through difficult stuff, but don't feel the effects of trauma. But if at some point we run out of those reserves, if we lose the ability to adapt to that trauma, now all of a sudden it's really starting to be injurious to us. And so I think one of the best ways to kind of characterize that is to say, look, trauma is not an experience, it's what happens inside of us as a result of an experience. That's one of the most useful definitions I've found for it. So what we're talking about when we're dealing with trauma is, like I said, we're dealing with more than we have the capacity to deal with. So if we just have stuff coming our way and it builds up too much for too long, we find ourselves having to function in ways that we don't feel like we're equipped to handle, or things that are beyond our capacities or our resources. And maybe we have to have a complete shift in what we expect the future to look like. We may have had this expectation that, hey, everything's going to be okay. But as we get overloaded, we might lose that. We might say, you know what? I don't know if everything's going to be okay. I don't know if I'm going to be okay. I'm not sure that the future holds hope, right? We kind of feel ourselves sliding towards that pathway of not being able to adapt to everything as it comes along. And as soon as the stuff happening to us begins to overwhelm the resources, whether they're internal to us or the support structure that we have around us, that's what gets us into overload. That can get us into depression, anxiety, and if it's extreme enough, take us into the realm of trauma. Another thing to remember too is we've talked about the fact that we probably don't have unlimited trauma capacity, right? We can take some pretty big hits and come back, but it may be that took a little bit out of us, and it'll take us a while to recharge our batteries, to kind of restore the resources that we had to help us adapt to whatever happened to us. And if there's something big that's happened in the recent past, wow, okay, that's taken a hit to our reserves, and we may not be able to bounce back quite the same way. If you want to take this to an extreme, right? I'm talking about an extreme. We can all remember earlier this spring, back when it rained in Oklahoma. I know it's a distant memory to a lot of us, but it actually did rain in Oklahoma in the spring, and that usually came from storms. We had the town of Sulphur, the town of Barnesdall, Marietta. We had lots of communities that got hit by tornadoes. And even in the midst of recovery and rescue efforts, example, in Sulphur, we had another tornado warning coming on top of everything that had happened earlier in that evening. So we are dealing with a tornado, and we haven't really had a chance to recover from that tornado when another tornado is coming our way. We might have had a tornado hit an area, but we didn't get the rain associated with the storm. And then within a few weeks, we have a wildfire. So it's just important to remember, when you're looking out for people and you're looking out for yourself, ask yourself what's happened in that person's area, or what's happened in the area generally, that may have taken something out of our ability to deal with trauma. Have we already kind of emptied the tank a little bit? And if so, we need to be even more on our guard for watching out as to what those negative effects might be for our neighbors. So the question is, when we see that someone has suffered a trauma, whether it's an individual trauma, whether it's a broader disaster, do we need to talk, or do we need to do some other stuff first? And I'll point out, by the way, that we have held a belief for some time, and it was a genuine, authentically held belief in therapeutic circles, that whenever someone had suffered a traumatic event, they needed to debrief. Like, as soon as we can, let's get you to talk about what happened to you, get those feelings out, right? And we just said the fact that we need to get our feelings out there sometimes to deal with those. But what we've learned, especially in the wake of 9/11, and we had a tremendous amount of research go into how to best help the victims of the 9/11 attacks, what we realized is that, yeah, sometimes you do need to do that, but that might not be something that we do immediately. That may be something that needs to occur a pretty significant amount of time after the trauma. There might be steps that we need to take well before we get to the person talking about those feelings. And oh, by the way, if we try to do that too soon, we might be unconsciously shoving that person back into the traumatic experience when they're trying to get out. So what do we do here? What we need to do is take a longer term approach and kind of prioritize what's the immediate response, what's the intermediate response, what's the long-term response there. So, I'm sorry, I went a little bit too fast there. We're going to talk about these steps real quickly. We're going to talk about how you safeguard, sustain, comfort, connect, educate, and empower the person who's had the traumatic or disaster event occur to them. So when we talk about safeguard, it is exactly what popped right into your head when I said safeguard, right? If a person is in physical danger, we've got to get them out of physical danger. Get them out of the burning building, get them out of the rubble from the tornado, get them out of the flood waters, get them out of the path of the wildfire, right? The most base thing we can possibly do is make sure that person is physically safe. So get them out of the danger however you can. Make sure that person is in a secure place so that there's not a risk of something happening to them secondary to the event. You know, classic example of this is if someone's been in a car accident. Car accidents tend to happen on the road. Let's get the person out of the wreckage, right, in a safe way. But then let's get them off of the road, because we all know how many accidents occur by people being hit on roads while they're responding to something else. So that's an example of getting the person immediately safe, but then getting them to a secure location as well. And then if we're in a situation where they need shelter, let's take care of that. If there's another storm coming, if we're in the midst of a winter storm event, if there's the potential of fires coming along, let's find a place where they have a shelter from the environment and a place where they can settle and begin to feel that safety again. Now, here comes sustain. And I will remind you again, ladies and gentlemen, Oklahoma, you guys get gold stars, merit badges, whatever other accolades I can throw at you for sustain, because by gosh, in Oklahoma, we sustain our neighbors when something goes wrong. I remember after my brother had his farm accident, we wish we had another deep freeze because of all the casseroles that came our way, right? We did not lack for food for weeks as a result of that. But that's a good thing, right? What we're doing is we're saying, hey, we want to make sure that your needs are met. Food, water, clothing, shelter. If you need medications, but whatever your physical needs are, that's a big part of you feeling safe, like we mentioned previously, right? That short-term safety being removed from the danger, but now we're moving into our feeling of long-term safety. I know that I'm going to be okay for the foreseeable future because I have food, water, clothing, housing. I'm going to be okay. My physical needs are going to be there and taken care of. I will say, since I'm talking to Farm Bureau today, right? We're obviously taking care of our humans, but I'll also say that Farm Bureau and our other ag organizations are extremely good about taking care of the non-humans. If there's been a disaster, how do we take care of the cattle, the poultry, the swine, the horses, whatever's out there? Let's find a way to help them out too. And especially in agriculture, we often put the well-being of our livestock before ours. We're not going to be able to find a place of psychological safety if we're constantly worried about the animals that we're taking care of. So safeguarding and caring for the needs of someone's livestock may be every bit as important to them as taking care of them themselves. So again, gold marks to Oklahoma for doing that. We're always phenomenal on that point. Now let's talk about comfort. So we're moving a little bit now out of safeguarding physical safety and needs. Now we're trying to safeguard psychological safety and needs. So we're kind of moving down that spectrum, right? So when we talk about comfort, it's hard sometimes to model calm. The classic example I have from one of my favorite baseball experts was, if you're going to a little league game and you're worried that your kid is nervous at the plate, don't put your face up against the fence going, calm down, relax, you're going to be fine. That really doesn't help the kid a lot. You have to model calm. Hey, buddy, I know you're nervous up there. It's okay. We're here for you, right? It's your tone of voice, especially in this mode. Your nonverbal cues are so important. So what you say to the person, is important, but almost every bit as important, and maybe even more important, is how you say it. Hey, a big scary thing happened to you. I can sure understand why you'd be a little rattled right now. I'm going to make sure that you're okay. I'm going to take care of you. There are other people here that are going to take care of you. We're going to make sure you're okay. That body language and that tone of voice is really important. The person might not want to talk about what happened, and we've talked about the fact that's okay. But if they do want to talk, get your ears on and just listen. And it's important for us to remember that we need to listen respectfully and non-judgmentally. I'm sure that we're all experts at everything, right? And if this wildfire happened to you, gosh, if you just would have used better pasture management, if you would have irrigated that field instead of trying to be cheap, yada, 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 this wouldn't have happened to you. Not the time, folks, okay? You want to listen respectfully and non-judgmentally. Would you have done things differently? Maybe. Would the things that happened to this person affect you differently? Yeah, maybe. But that's not what we're here for. We're here to talk to this person about how it affected them. So that non-judgmental listening is a tough skill to develop. I know. I have a 10-year-old. He comes home from school and will lay out what happened in the day. And it was hard for him. And in my mind, I'm like, well, son, if you wouldn't have done this, this, and this, it would have that's not what I'm here for. We'll teach life lessons later. Hey, son, I'm sorry that you had a bad day. I can see if that stuff would have happened to me, I probably would have been upset too. And, just listen in that non-judgmental, respectful, kind way. Now, while you're doing this, you need to be on the lookout for some signs that some trauma may have occurred to the person. And sometimes those things will manifest themselves in a physiological way. Does the person seem disoriented? Do they just simply seem to have a lack of awareness about where they actually are or what's going on? If they do, that's a sign of what we would call dissociation, right? Where they are mentally is not where they are physically. So that can be a sign that some deep trauma may have occurred. If they're non-responsive, if they have that glassy kind of 1,000-yard stare that we talk about, that's another sign of dissociation. If they are showing strong emotional reactions, I mean, people have emotional reactions after a trauma or a disaster, but if it seems to be even greater than you would expect, that can be a sign. Do they have rapid breathing? Is their pulse rate high? Are they vomiting, or are they having a loss of bladder or bowel control? Those can all be signs that we've got something pretty significant here, and we have trauma, maybe perhaps even rising to the level of shock, and we need to engage the help of a medical professional as soon as we can. If you see that that's going on, make sure that you take the time to engage, right? Jaclyn talked about the awareness that her, I believe it was cousin, had to call 911. So someone engages the emergency response system, right? While you're waiting on that help to arrive, do what you can to help that person feel calm, stable, and safe. And remember, that's the slow, calm tone of voice. You can help them model breathing. Say, hey, I know that you're breathing kind of fast. I'm here to tell you it's going to be okay. Can you breathe with me? Let's go it slow. Let's go in through the nose and hold it for a little bit, and then go out through the mouth. Try to model it for them. That can kind of help them. They have to pattern their calm after yours. So that may be tough for you in a difficult situation, but remember, you have to be the model of what you want to see from them. Now, let's move on to comforting, right? We may have moved that person beyond the immediate danger zone of the psychological impacts, but now let's talk about how we can help them more long-term. We've already kind of mentioned, right, the fact that we can model deep breathing for them. Another thing we can do is if they're really in a dissociative state, they aren't really aware of where they are, or they're back in the event, even though the event is in the past, let's help them get into the present. Part of this real stress, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, is because the brain is trying to put the person somewhere that they actually aren't. So let's bring them into what we would call the present, right? Let's get them here. So one really useful tool for this is to say, hey, tell me one thing you can see. Tell me one thing you can hear. Tell me one thing you can smell, taste, touch, so on. And what we're doing when we ask them to do that is we're asking them to disconnect from the memory center of the brain and turn to the senses. That will just naturally have the effect of bringing them present, bringing them back to where they actually are, and getting them out of the memory cycle. Okay. Now, again, we obviously want to do this when this person is safe. If they're still in the danger zone, Forget that. Physical safety first, then our psychological safety there. But as you do get them to safety, say, hey, remember, we're going to make sure that you're okay. We're going to take care of you. You're out of danger. Things are going to be okay, and give them that reassurance. Once we've moved out of that, now let's get that person connected to some support. And I will admit, I am a extroverted introvert. I actually am an introverted person. Everybody that meets me like, you're a liar. Like, no, I really am an introvert. I'm just an introvert that actually can handle talking to people. But whenever I need to kind of recharge my batteries, I like to be alone for a little bit. But I also recognize, even as an introvert, I need connection. You know, whenever I'm dealing with heavy stuff, I need to talk to my wife. I need to talk to my friend. I need to talk to my therapist, right? I need to share that in some way. So how do we help folks connect with those resources? We want to find folks that are going to support their emotional well-being. And that doesn't have to be a professional therapist, right? It may include a professional therapist for sure, but we also need to put them in touch with their family, their loved ones, their friends, the people that are for them, right? So we want to find the group that just supports that person's emotional well-being, that we know cares about them. But there's another effect here. We can choose to live in our trauma. And by the way, if you're experiencing trauma, I'm not saying that that's a choice for you, okay? But what I'm saying is, if we choose to isolate ourselves long enough, we are kind of putting ourselves back into the trauma. And if we kind of keep thinking about the event, or we keep wondering what we could have done differently, well, we're taking ourselves back into the trauma, and that builds that cycle that deepens those trauma impacts. Okay. So we want to kind of pull ourselves out of that cycle, and talking to your friend, maybe about what happened, or maybe about what happened in the Brewers and Mets game last night. Right? If baseball is your thing, hey, let's talk about baseball for a while and get ourselves out of talking about what happened in the wildfire. There are all sorts of folks that can help out with this. We've talked about friends and family, you know, your clergy, the person that helps you with your faith journey, other community members, and then pets. Don't overlook the power of pets. I am here next door to Dr. Courtney Burr, who has Millie, one of Pete's Pet Posse members here. And it's amazing what Pete's Pet Posse does for our students here. I was always skeptical about this, and I'll give you one quick experience, though. I was going through what I didn't really realize was major depressive disorder. I figured it out later. But I was at a conference about solar energy, of all things. And the person sitting next to me had their dog at the conference about solar energy. I was curious, so I said, hey, tell me some about your pup. And it turns out that my neighbor in the conference was a person who worked for BIA, but they were a former combat medic in Afghanistan who was dealing with PTSD, and that was their therapy dog. So I knelt down just to kind of be at eye level with the pup, and he hugged me. I don't know if you've ever been hugged by a dog. Like, he didn't jump up on me, but the dog literally like hugged me. And I never realized how much I'd needed a hug from a dog until he did it. So there's pretty powerful, you know, therapeutic energy in our pets. And maybe it's not a dog, maybe it's a cat, maybe it's your horse, maybe it's just your show animal. But there are all sorts of people and also creatures that can help us feel better as well. And then, yeah, oh, by the way, you know, therapists, that's kind of what they're trained to do. And I think in agriculture, sometimes we say, therapists are only for people with real problems, like real problems. Well, everybody's got real problems, okay? So don't feel like you have to cross some sort of threshold, right? Like, my problem's here and you got to be here to talk to a therapist. Forget that, man. If you're dealing with something, talk to a professional. If you had appendicitis, you wouldn't be like, you know what, if I just had more strength of character, I wouldn't have appendicitis. I can think my way out of this. That's crazy, right? But we're going to talk about the fact that trauma is a physical injury to our nervous system. So if you would see a doctor for an appendicitis issue, you should probably see a doctor for a trauma issue as well. So it's okay to talk to somebody and get that professional level of help. Then comes educate. If you're trying to help somebody out, make sure that they are aware of what resources out there. And I want to be very clear about this. I said educate, not preach. Okay. Gently let the person know, like, hey, if you're going through some stuff, I know where you can get some help to deal with the physical needs that you have. I know of someone you could talk to if you have to, deal with some pretty difficult emotions. There's this website OSU's got. If you're a farmer, it's specifically made for people in stress. It's for a farm stress website, and everybody in farming's got stress, right? You're just kind of helping the person become aware of those resources. And of course, those might include like the basic needs like housing, financial support, but also emotional and spiritual support. And it might be beneficial for folks to know how this kind of trauma might affect them. Like, hey, I know you had a pretty rough car accident. People that go through car accidents can deal with some difficult emotional issues. Here's what you might expect. Or you might know that there's some physical issues out there. We don't want to be caught off guard by that. It's just kind of letting people know that, the old saying that we got from G.I. Joe, knowing's half the battle, right? So help them to connect with educational resources that tell them how they can get help and how they can help themselves. Then lastly here, excuse me, I got a little dried out there. We want to empower that person to get back to whatever normal looks like for them now. And normal might not be what normal was before the trauma occurred, but there can be a new normal. They can find a new place of equilibrium and resilience and safety. So help them get back to that. And that may come in the form of just helping them realize that, hey, I can do the stuff that I used to enjoy. I can go fishing, hunting, hiking, play sports, cook, watch movies with friends, whatever it is, right? And depending on the effects of the trauma, that might look a little different, or we might do it in a different way, but it can still be there for you. So help that person kind of get back to what their new normal is, and help them to get back into things that get them out of that cycle of anxiety and concern, things that help them relax and to take care of themselves. So let's say we've gone through all of this with someone and we're still kind of concerned that we're seeing some signs that the person might still not be okay. What does that look like? Well, the first thing I look for is isolation. Matter of fact, I've scheduled a lunch with a friend who'd been kind of withdrawing from some of the activities that we're usually both at. And some other friends that we have in our same friend circle noticed that. They said, hey, Ferrell, you're closer to that guy. See if you can get him to lunch and just make sure he's okay, because we've noticed he hasn't been showing up at the meetings. He hasn't been kind of on our chats. He hasn't been there at the happy hours. Make sure that he's okay, because it seems like he might be withdrawing. It's hard for us to notice the person that just kind of quietly disappears. If a person is all of a sudden, engaging in very active displays of emotion, they're getting loud, or they're being very extreme in their behavior, hey, we'll all take notice of that, right? That's easy to notice. It's a lot more challenging to notice the person that kind of slowly sort of shrinks in and just kind of doesn't show up to church or the ball games or the meetings or things like that. So that might be a sign that they're kind of retreating into themselves. So watch out for that level of isolation. But the flip side's true, right? If they're blowing up, that's a sign that we need to keep an eye out for as well. That person that's being very emotive, very expressive, maybe engaging in reckless behavior. If they seem to be having really strong reactions to things that would otherwise be pretty innocuous, if there is a storm cloud on the horizon, they seem to be really panicked. Anytime somebody's doing a controlled burn, they have a really strong reaction. Those might all be indicators that something about that is triggering an event in their mind, right? We'll talk about paired associations here in just a little bit, but that's kind of an indicator of one of those PTSD anxiety symptoms. If they've mentioned thoughts of suicide, or just kind of they're talking about suicide a lot, that's something we want to watch out for as well. So if we're talking about suicidality, right? Ask the person, hey, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Are you thinking about taking your own life? It's okay to ask, right? We have tons of research that say you're not going to put the idea in the person's head. It's already there. Okay. You won't push them into suicide by mentioning it. If anything, you'll shock them out of it, or at least let them know that someone cares enough to have a difficult conversation with them. So ask, are they having suicidal thoughts? Do they have a plan? Do they have access to lethal means? And ladies and gentlemen, in agriculture, man, there are lots of ways for us to hurt ourselves on the farm. Okay. So just ask them, hey, what's going through your head? Let's talk about this. If they are willing to talk about it, then I said, again, listen empathetically. Don't get preachy. Don't say, well, I wouldn't do that. We're not talking about you. We're talking about them. Okay. Whatever happened to them, is what got them here. They had the experience, they had the emotional response, so we're going to deal with them on their terms. We have an acronym called Is Path Warm? That's a topic for another webinar on another day, but just look for some of the signs that we've already talked about. But if a person is talking about suicide or self-harm, it's exactly as if we were a person who started CPR on a person having a heart attack. If you've ever had a CPR training, you know that if you start CPR, you can't quit until either a medical professional comes along to relieve you or you're physically exhausted and just cannot go on. Well, it's the same thing here. If someone has expressed thoughts of suicide or self-harm, you can't leave them until you've connected them with a professional to relieve you, or until you're absolutely convinced that the danger is past. In the past year, I've had a young person express those kinds of thoughts to me, and for the next 24 hours, I was glued to them. Okay, either me or another person we would hand off, but no one could leave that person alone until we were convinced that they were actually in a better place. Let them know that you're going to get some help. All right, this is something pretty serious. Let's call 911. Let's get someone actually in here to help you out. And again, make sure they don't have any access to anything that's lethal. Okay, I told everybody in the webinar, I'm going to keep this to an hour. I'm going to get everybody out of here by 1 o'clock. I know I'm in danger of that. I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit. But I want to talk about a very specific kind of traumatic response we call PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And PTSD is, I'm sorry, my bolt's got a line there. It's an anxiety disorder. It is, you might think of a very intense, very acute anxiety disorder, where we will see a person have a very strong paired association event. I keep saying paired association. That's better than trigger. People in the psychological community hate the word trigger. It's gotten massively overused and misused. So we're going to talk about a paired association. And what I mean by that is that in the process of the mind processing emotions and memories, it has created a very strong connection to an item or an event or a condition. And when that occurs, our anxiety response, hey, the brain's trying to keep us safe. We know that thing's dangerous. So we start all the physiological responses that would go with fight, flight, or freeze in response to that. And I'll give you an example here. Sorry, my bullets are animating weird. If someone's having really painful thoughts when they encounter an association, if they start to demonstrate really intense emotions, if they start to have those physiological symptoms, increased breathing rate, increased pulse rate, sweats, maybe shaking, things like that, it's because their brain is taking them back. It's taking them out of where they are now, back to the place where they encountered the trauma. And I've got a picture of a backpack here, and you're like, fantastic, Ferrell, what's so traumatic about a backpack? For us, probably nothing, right? It's that thing that I carried my books into school, right? Or maybe I really have positive memories of backpacks, so I went backpacking with my family. But if you're a soldier and you know that lots of times improvised explosive devices were carried by people in backpacks and left on benches or sidewalks or things like that, you see a backpack, you very strongly associate that with extreme danger, perhaps death, okay? It could be lightning, thunder, fireworks. I was listening to a story from a therapist who had dealt with a person where it was a grasshopper or a radiator. So it doesn't matter that you wouldn't make the association. That's irrelevant. The relevant thing is, does that person make that association? And if you see that kind of an associative event, right, where someone sees something that we would expect a normal person to view as being pretty innocuous, but they have a really strong reaction to it, that tells us that there might be PSD or some similar condition at work there. So why does this happen? And I want to talk to you guys about neurophysiology for just a second. As a lawyer, I'm obviously qualified to talk about neurophysiology. I want to talk to you guys about this for one very simple reason. In agriculture specifically, and if we're talking about generational differences generally, there are lots of people that think everything from PTSD to depression to anxiety, that it's all in your head. If you had stronger character or if you had stronger faith, you wouldn't have this problem, right? It's a defect in character. It's a defect in you. I'm here to tell you that PTSD and a lot of other trauma impacts are a physiological response. It started out being mental and emotional, but as a result of conditions continuing as they were, it is now a physiological response. But the good thing about a physiological response is that can be healed too. So let's talk about your amygdala for a second, right? Your amygdala is kind of your body's sensor net, right? It's looking at all of your senses to make sure, is there danger, or is this guy safe? Is everything okay? After you've had a traumatic event occur, when something really bad happened to you, what do you think would happen to your amygdala, right? It grows. It's like, whoa, man, something bad happened. I've got to be even more attuned. I've got to put my sensors on maximum range, maximum intensity. I'm going to be constantly scanning for threats now because something really big happened. So after trauma, our amygdala grows. We are now even more sensitive to threats than we were before, perhaps way more. Now let's talk about the hippocampus. Your hippocampus helps you process emotions and memories. After you've had a traumatic event, your brain releases a lot of cortisol through your nervous system. And cortisol is a stress hormone, and it kind of does some nasty stuff, right? It's there for a reason. It's meant to put the maximum amount of physical resources at your disposal. You're facing a really dangerous thing, so I'm going to give you more strength in your muscles. I'm going to increase your pulse and breathing rate. I'm going to take blood out of your brain. You don't need it there, right? And I'm also going to start metabolizing your muscles, meaning that your body is kind of literally eating itself because it needs the absolute maximum amount of energy to fight, flight, or maybe freeze. Okay. Fantastic, Ferrell. So what you're saying is that my hippocampus can maybe do some really bad stuff. No, your hippocampus is fine. Your amygdala is doing this. But when you have that release of cortisol, it's attacking your amygdala. So your amygdala, I'm sorry, your hippocampus, I apologize. Your hippocampus, I got mixed up there. Your hippocampus is being attacked by cortisol. Your amygdala is going off. Your hippocampus is actually getting smaller, right? And one of the things, like I said, your hippocampus does is it helps you process memories. One of the reasons that people that deal with PTSD find themselves so sharply taken back into the traumatic event itself from where they are presently now is the fact that their brain has a reduced ability to tell between what's a memory and what's actually happening. That's one of those very important neurophysiological responses. Because our hippocampus has been damaged by what happened to us in the trauma, we lose to some extent, or perhaps to a great extent, our ability to tell what's a memory and what's happening right now. And if we've had a really traumatic memory and we get taken back into it, we feel like we're there now. It's happening to us again. And that's pretty difficult. By the same token, our prefrontal cortex, the part at the front of your brain right here, that's in charge of higher order functioning, gets diminished and weakened as well. So we have increased communication going on between our amygdala and our hippocampus. They're locked in this loop. Our hippocampus has gotten smaller. We can't distinguish between memory and what's going on right now. And the part of our brain that would allow us to say, hey, stop, let's think about this. I'm not there, I'm here. It's been diminished as well. So when we talk about trauma, okay, it's not like, wow, this big bad thing happened to you, but if you were tougher, you'd have handled it. No, you're going through physiological changes that make it even more difficult for you to know what's going on and to actively combat it. So it really is a physiological condition there. How can we fix that? We can fix that, right? We have this thing called neuroplasticity. Your brain and your nervous system can repair itself over time. So can we do that? Sure. There's lots of ways that we can do that, and we could list them all, but I'm already about to run out of time there. But I'll just say that one of the therapeutic techniques, one of the behavioral techniques that a therapist might use is to diffuse your trigger, right? To slowly break up that paired association. And that happens by facing your fear in a gradual and controlled way. The extreme of that is if you're afraid of heights, maybe don't just go skydiving immediately, right? That's not the way to do it. That's kind of the extreme way of doing it. You might talk to a therapist about, what your paired association is. I'm trying to think of a good example here. I had one before the meeting started. I'm so sorry. Well, I'll talk about my kiddo for a second. You know, my kiddo has some anxiety issues, and he's really afraid of large animals. So that's kind of tough when you have a livestock show project in 4-H. And so what we have done with him, and we've had some success at this, is gradually work him up, right? We'll talk about how do you properly handle the animal. We'll talk about what might happen in the ring. We'll let him watch someone show the animal. We'll show the animal alongside him. We'll let him show the animal in a small, really confined environment, like maybe it's the stall, right? Then work our way to a bigger pen, and then eventually he shows in the state fair arena, right? It's gradually exposing the person to that fear in a safe way so they know they're taking those incremental steps, right? And that can actually be really effective over time if we do it the right way. I need to kind of bring the plane in for a landing here because I know that we're running out of time. I want to put this, in really bold print up there. You do not need to be ashamed or guilty about your trauma. And if you don't already, I want you to get on social media and find the Do More Ag Foundation. It is a foundation based in Canada, but they are very specifically focused on mental health issues in agriculture. I was watching one of their webinars, and they had a statement from someone, and I wish I could give them credit because it was an amazing quote. They said, people drown in oceans, people drown in creeks, and people drown in bathtubs. And what they were saying is, look, you don't need to feel guilty that you've experienced anxiety, depression, PTSD, or anything out of whatever it was. Whatever happened to you might have happened to somebody else, and it didn't affect them at all. Who cares? It impacted you. You're maybe thinking to yourself, well, whatever happened to me, it's not big enough to cause trauma. Baloney. If it caused trauma, it caused trauma. Okay. So don't feel like you have to reach some sort of threshold to feel validated that you had the experience that you did. You didn't invite your trauma. And especially for people that have been victims of assault or all kinds of, mistreatment at the hands of other people versus perhaps a natural disaster or something like that. They feel guilty. They feel like they did something to either invite the trauma to occur or invite it to continue. And I'm here to tell you that ain't it. Okay. You don't have to feel guilty about what happened to you. It wasn't your fault. You don't have to feel that. And doing that, this becomes more and more isolating. So please don't feel like you have to feel guilty about what happened to you. It wasn't your fault. You didn't invite that to happen to you. Last and certainly not least, don't suck at self-compassion. And I'm here to tell you why I'm phrasing that in such a way. I had major depressive disorder coming out of the pandemic. It wasn't just the pandemic. It was a lot of things that happened to me individually while the pandemic was going on. And I was talking to my therapist about, I can't remember what the topic was, but I was being kind of hard on myself. That's kind of one of my defining personality traits. And she said, you know what, Shannon, you seem like a pretty compassionate guy. I mean, it seems like you're very kind to other people. Why aren't you kind and compassionate to yourself? The moment she said that, there was a voice in my head, my very self-critical voice that said, yeah, Ferrell, you do suck at self-compassion. And I laughed out loud. And my therapist said, what did you just think? Because I could tell you thought something and then you immediately laughed at the thought. I'm like, well, my brain said I suck at self-compassion. So don't suck at self-compassion. I bet that you're a pretty compassionate person. Be compassionate to yourself. You should be every bit as compassionate to yourself as you are to anybody around you. So please don't forget that. Last and certainly not least here, okay? I just want to point out the fact that it is okay to get help. This is Leonid Rogozov. He was the only doctor on an Antarctic expedition led by the Soviet Union in the 1950s. Remember, he's the only doctor on the expedition. While they're on the expedition, he develops appendicitis. You're the only doctor on your expedition. Who's going to remove your appendix? And the answer is he did. He performed the first medically documented autoappendectomy, meaning he took out his own appendix, looking in a mirror, by the way, while someone was handling him tools. So, can you remove your own appendix? Yeah. Should you do it if there's anybody else who could do it for you? No. Can you heal yourself? Sure, there's lots of self-care stuff you can do. But if it's to the point where you're like, I don't know, like it feels like what I'm doing isn't working. I'm not getting any traction. I don't feel like I'm getting better. I'm either sitting still or I'm stuck or I'm actually going backwards. It's okay to get help, right? Go get some professional help. And that's really important. Take care of yourself. Okay. Self-care gets a bad rap in agriculture because it's got the word self in it. It's okay to take care of yourself. You're probably the most important resource on your farm. You take care of your tractor, you take care of your combine, you take care of your livestock. So why in the world isn't it okay to take care of you, because you're every bit as important on the farm as anything else is, right? So don't let self-care be the thing that holds you back. Take care of yourself. Call it maintenance if you have to, right? And if you see somebody that needs help, don't be afraid to let them know that you care and that you're willing to help them. This is a verse that came up in a summit that we had at our church about mental health issues in the church. And a wonderful therapist here in the Stillwater community was there as part of the panel. And she pointed to this verse and said, I want you to take out the word paralyzed here. I want you to insert depressed or anxious or traumatized, where that would be, and realize that you might be the person that needs to carry that other person to help. So if it's going to your friend and saying, hey, if you want to get some help, I'll go with you as far as you want me to go. I will drive you there. So it's my pickup in front of the therapist and not yours. I will walk you into the office. I'll walk into the office with you if you want me to, but I'll take you as far as you want to go. I think that's one of the most important and beautiful things that we can do for the people in our lives is if we see that we need help, if we've got to carry them there willingly, by the way, but if we've got to carry them there, let's get them there. Okay. With that, I know I've gone over my time. I apologize for that. I told everybody on the call that if you get me revved up on this, I'll keep going. I do just want to point out that if you liked what we talked about today and you want to learn more, just go to our OSU Farm Stress website. It's impossible to remember that URL. So just Google Oklahoma State University Farm Stress. That'll take you there. We have all sorts of resources there, everything from self-care and maintenance to how to deal with suicidality and the people around us. Feel free to go out and pursue getting your mental health first aid certification. It's a fantastic 8-hour training. It just takes a day, but it's hugely valuable if you're worried about helping someone with a suicidal issue. QPR offers a 3-hour training that's fantastic as well. With that, I've exhausted my time. Thank you guys so much for thinking enough about this issue that you wanted to tune in. We're so grateful that you took the time to do that and that you care about yourself and the people in your community to do that. With that, I'll be quiet. I'll open things back up to Jacob to see if we have any questions out there that we need to address before we wrap up for the day.
Wow, that's amazing presentation, Dr. Ferrell. Thank you so much. And always you just offer the just most top tier quality information. I really appreciate it. I could listen to you talk about it all day. So, but every time I came up with a question, we would go through and you would nail it. So I don't personally have anything. I do want to just, you mentioned the dog stress relief. We have a SRD is what my dad calls a stress relief dog here at our business. That exact reason. I mean, we love having the dog, and also the dog can't stay home by itself. But yeah, thank you so much. We're so blessed to have such a wonderful opportunity to have some outreach here into the farming community, and we're blessed to have wonderful people like yourself and Jaclyn who are willing to talk and to help others with this conversation. So thank you so much for doing this today. Again, we just really appreciate the time that you've committed to doing this.
Well, thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We appreciate you all so much.